There is also a recent development which is procedurally objectionable, Mr. President, based on our Constitution. The President has just sent to the Senate the presidential certification to the necessity of the immediate enactment of Senate Bill number 2020. This is based on the power of the President. This is based on the power granted to the President under Article 6, Section 26, Paragraph 2 of the 1987 Constitution, which reads as follows. No bill passed by either house shall become a law unless it has passed 3 readings on separate days, and printed copies thereof in its final form have been distributed to its members 3 days before its passage, except when the President certifies to the necessity of its immediate enactment to meet a public calamity or emergency. This has been a much abused power by the office of the President. The office of the President has even certified the national budget for year 2023, an act which or a law which we consider and pass year in and year out at predictable periods of the year. And here we are again, facing a presidential certification of necessity or urgency when there is actually no public calamity or emergency right before our very eyes, which could be addressed by the Maharlika Bill. How could a fund with promised benefits to be felt 10 to 20 years from now be the answer to an existing public calamity or emergency? That is a question that this representation would want to be answered, Mr. President. The existence of a public calamity or emergency is a constitutional requirement that should be taken seriously. If it is not present, then there should be no ground for a presidential certification. I therefore urge the Senate to set aside the presidential certification for the Maharlika Bill, for it is unconstitutional. Mr. President and my dear colleagues, I have reached the part where I share my conclusions, Mr. President. While the MIF may have been presented to us as an appealing proposition with a noble intention, that is to boost investment and grow our money, it carries significant risks that the Philippines cannot afford to make. The overall risk is too great that it outweighs whatever the potential benefits of the measure are, if there is any at all. With our current fiscal and economic situation, we cannot afford to make a 500 billion peso mistake or even a 75 billion peso mistake. This will be a costly mistake that will be paid with our people's hard-earned money, representing their blood, sweat, and tears. Although a mistake like this can also allow others to lead a lavish lifestyle, if you know what I mean. The implications of the proposed Maharlika Investment Fund are simply too great for us not to do anything to stop it. The following are good grounds to reject the Maharlika Investment Fund Act. These are the reasons why the Philippines should not establish a sovereign wealth fund or a state investment fund or a state-initiated investment fund or a national investment fund or however way we might want to call it. Number one, the Philippines is a developing country with a large and growing population, and we have a number of pressing economic and social challenges that need to be addressed. Establishing a sovereign wealth fund, or the MIF, would require the government to divert resources away from these more immediate priorities, such as poverty, malawak ang kahirapan ng ating mga mamayan, hunger, kakulangan sa pagkain, debt, utang, quality education and healthcare, murang pabahay, kuryente at tubig, jobs, trabaho, and reducing inequality and injustice, among others. Number two, the Philippines is not a major exporter of natural resources such as oil and gas. which are the main sources of revenue for many sovereign wealth funds. This means that the Philippines would need to find other sources of funding for its sovereign wealth fund, or the MIF, which could be difficult and potentially involve taking on more debt. Number three, there is no surplus, no budget surplus, no trade surplus. There is no windfall revenue or profit from anything at all, which will serve as the funding for this MIF. We cannot even point to the underlying asset for this MIF because there is none. The Philippines, number four, the Philippines has a history of corruption and mismanagement of public funds, which raises concerns about the transparency and accountability of a sovereign wealth fund, or this MIF. There have been numerous instances of government officials misusing public funds for personal gain, and there are concerns that the sovereign wealth fund, or this MIF, could be used as a means of disguising or concealing corrupt activities. Number five, the Philippines is already facing significant economic challenges, including a large and growing budget deficit, high levels of debt, a weak currency, and high inflation. Our fiscal space has shrunk. Food production is very low, yet smuggling is very rampant. Establishing a sovereign wealth fund, or this MIF, could further strain our country's financial resources and increase our dependence on external funding, which could make us more vulnerable to external economic shocks and market fluctuations. Number six, we should fund the budget instead of the MIF. Come to think of it, the MIF bill is, if not an insult to Congress, an indictment of the budget process. The proponents of this MIF bill would rather have an unelected 9-person board of directors meeting behind closed doors in a conference room the Filipino people cannot freely enter, decide on the approval and funding of big-ticket mega infrastructure projects, rather than the elected members of Congress whose proceedings are open to the public, covered by the media, and even live-streamed. The MIC can change the landscape of our country without the participation of the people's elective representatives. Why should we in Congress allow this to happen? Number seven, the current version of the MIF has too many inherent inconsistencies, not to mention the very difficult to understand paragraphs and sections in the said bill. Number eight, too many details are left to the IRR. Hence, we have no idea how the MIF will finally look like and how it will be governed. Number nine, the creation of the MIF could undermine democratic principles in the management of funds and weaken democratic institutions, for transparency and accountability are compromised in the MIF. We should not forget that transparency and accountability are the foundations that allow democracy to thrive. Number 10, since the MIF will invest domestically and can partner with private business interests, the MIF can, in effect, choose who will be the winners in our domestic economy. We must therefore always be on the lookout for favoritism, crony capitalism, and unequal treatment in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Number 11, I submit that before we can decide on establishing the MIF, we have to first answer the prejudicial questions which I have raised before. Like, number 1, is it economically viable? Number 2, have both Land Bank of the Philippines and the Development Bank of the Philippines been subjected to sensitivity tests? And number 3, are we proceeding with the proposed merger of the Land Bank and the Development Bank? Number 12, if the MIF is really being established for the Filipino people, including the future generations, And the proponents are so confident that the expected high returns will be realized and will really redound to the benefit of the Filipino people. Then I propose that the law establishing the Maharlika Wealth Fund be submitted to the Filipino people through a referendum. In short, the creation of the Maharlika Investment Fund, the MIF, will be more harmful to our economy, country, people, and our future than if the fund had not been created or were not to be created in the first place. Mr. President, my dear colleagues, the decision to allocate billions of pesos to the creation of this MIF or the Maharlika Investment Fund is a matter that should be carefully considered and reviewed by us. It is important to consider the potential risks associated with this measure. We should not rush our consideration of this bill. Allow me to quote the President, not the Senate President, the President of the Republic, when he was interviewed about the MIF. Ang message ko sa Senado, suriin ninyo na mabuti para magandang-maganda ang batas natin. Hindi naman dapat imadali dahil napaka-importante bawat salita na ilalagay mo dun sa batas na yun, may kabuluhan yun. Kailangan talagang pag-aralan ng mabuti. Malaki naman ang tiwala ko sa mga senador. Alam nila ang kanilang trabaho. Pag-aaralan talaga nila ng mabuti yan. And that's the process. Tama yun. But ako, sa akin, mas importante na maging tama kaysa sa maging mabilis. So, kailangan gawin natin tama. We have to get it right. Getting it wrong would be a very bad mistake. Those are the words of the President. So, my dear colleagues, in the Philippine Senate, President Bongbong Marcos addressed that message to us. Tayo po ang kausap ng Presidente dyan. So, to close, Mr. President, so thank you for the time that you've given me, Mr. President. To close, according to a former high-ranking central banker, okay, the Maharlika Investment Fund, or MIF, proposal is the madness of some people. I therefore object to the proposed establishment of the MIF, or the Maharlika Investment Fund. I take my consolation from the thought that the Filipino people know another meaning for the letters MIF, and that is that this madness isn't forever. And before I end, Mr. President, I move that the measure under consideration, the bill attached to the committee report, be referred or recommitted to the proper committee, which is the Committee on Government Corporations and Public Enterprises. So thank you, Mr. President, and my dear colleagues, for your time and attention.